Welcome, and thank you for joining us today to learn about how environmental literacy fits into implementation of the California Next Generation Science Standards. My name is Mary Briggs, and I am an Education Policy Analyst at the California School Boards Association. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Before we get started, I want to make a quick announcement. If at any time you have a question for presenters or a technical issue, please use the Questions tab of your GoToWebinar dashboard. Next. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenters. Our first presenter is Burr Tyler. Burr Tyler is a research associate in the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics program at West Ed, working primarily on evaluations in the areas of science and mathematics education and teacher preparation. She has also worked extensively in assessment and standards development. Ms. Tyler has a knowledge and experience on issues related to teacher training and professional development, vocational education, the next generation science standards, and standards-based student assessment. For the past 5 years, she has worked as project director of the evaluation of the California K-8 NGSS Early Implementers Initiative. Our second presenter is Katie Nilsson. Dr. Katie Nilsson is a research associate in science education in West Ed's STEM program. She has studied teaching and learning in a variety of settings, including classroom and outdoor locations, and a range of topic areas, including science, computer science, technology, and environmental education. Dr. Nilsson currently works on several research and evaluation projects examining the implementation of the next generation science standards. Welcome, Burr.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thanks everyone for joining us. We really appreciate this opportunity to share with you what we've learned over the past few years about environmental literacy and the next generation science standards, the NGSS. Next slide. This is who we are, just so you know what we look like. Next slide. I wanted to let you know that the reason we were asked to do this webinar is because last fall we wrote this report. Environmental instruction catalyzes standards-based science teaching. How environmental literacy aids implementation of the NGSS. We've actually written a series of evaluation reports for a public audience for California educational leaders about different aspects of the Early Implementers Initiative. And our report about environmental literacy was released in September of last year, and it's basically the basis of this talk. And at the end of our slides, there will be a link to the full report along with some other resources. Next slide, please. We're going to be talking today about why environmental literacy is important, how environmental literacy supports the NGSS, how you can support environmental literacy, and some challenges and resources. Next slide. Before we dive in, I wanted to give you a little background because the Early Implementers Initiative is the context for our learning about environmental literacy and the NGSS. The initiative, which is just ending now in June of 2020, was a 6-year initiative funded by the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, in which teachers and administrators in 8 districts and 2 charters around the state received extensive professional learning about the NGSS. And over the course of the initiative, we had the opportunity to visit all the districts multiple times, and that's really allowed us to learn a lot about NGSS implementation and what NGSS instruction looks like. And one of the biggest takeaways has been the impact on students. We have heard from almost every teacher who's participated, and we've seen for ourselves, and we've heard from administrators as well, that students really respond to NGSS teaching. And it's particularly effective in reaching traditionally underperforming students. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. I wanted to let you know that environmental literacy was not a focus of professional learning in the initiative until about year 4. But once it became an explicit goal, many teachers reported that it was a natural fit for the standards, and we'll take a look at how they fit together in a few minutes. One more thing before I move on. I wanted to emphasize something that I just said kind of in passing, because you are the California School Boards Association. I wanted to share a lesson that the initiative learned early on in its 6 years, based on what they were seeing in the first year. The leaders of the initiative, they actually decided to expand greatly the professional learning that they were providing to administrators, and in particular to principals, compared to what they had originally planned. And the reason for this was that they found that even when teachers said they were ready and willing to try the new teaching and the new pedagogy in their classrooms, many of them did not. They said they were reluctant to change their teaching because they were worried that their principals wouldn't understand or approve, because the NGSS are very different from the old science standards and from conventional teaching. So as a result, starting in year 2, every effort was made to help K-8 principals learn about the intent of the new standards, what instruction looks like, and how to support the teachers. And that effort really supported districts in making progress toward district-wide NGSS implementation. Okay, next slide. Now we can talk about why environmental literacy is important. Next slide, please. First, I want to ask you to think about your own relationship with the environment. I'm going to allow just a few seconds for you to think about what environmental issues you care about and why you care about them. Okay, next slide. We all have a personal relationship with the environment. We care about our surroundings, and that's as true for kids as it is for adults. Teachers told us that their students were really engaged when learning about the environment. And as you know, when students are engaged, they tend to learn more, participate more, remember more, and that's motivating for their teachers. Here's a teacher quote that we really like. When kids go on field trips, they come back and look at things differently. It really changes them. And I realized the world was alive. If that happened to me, that would happen to another human being. So there's an important element of equity here, because when instruction connects to the real world and the immediate environment, that's something that all kids can relate to. We all live in the environment. All students have something to bring to that discussion. And when students are interested and they care about the content, they participate more fully, they contribute their ideas, and they have the opportunity to really shine. And we've heard from teachers that students who were engaged much less and were not high performers in class really had a lot to contribute. They contributed in a meaningful way. And one teacher put it really well when they said, there are no wrong answers when we're exploring. Next slide, please. An environmentally literate person. What do we mean by environmentally literate person? The California's blueprint, CDE's California Blueprint for Environmental Literacy, defines an environmentally literate person in a single sentence, but I've kind of parsed it out into some points too. So the bullets are mine, and if you look at the blueprint, it won't look like this, but I wanted to highlight some things. So environmentally literate person has the capacity to act individually and with others to support ecologically sound, economically prosperous, and equitable communities for present and future generations. So I've highlighted 3 key words here to sort of emphasize that environmental literacy pertains to the interrelationship of humans and the environment. And the goal is for students to gain an understanding of how we rely on and how we impact the environment. And there are social and cultural issues that come into play as well. So it's complex. And it goes on to say, as you can see in the second bullet, that students will gain educational experiences both in and out of the classroom. And third bullet, that those educational experiences will enable them to understand environmental issues and make informed decisions. Okay, next slide. Now that we know what environmental literacy is and a little bit about why it's important, let's look at how it supports NGSS instruction. First, I want to talk about the standards. A hallmark of the NGSS is that they are very hands-on, and that term doesn't even really do it justice. It is not a lab where students are asked to carry out a series of steps to prove correct what the teacher has told them. A critical part of the NGSS are the science and engineering practices, usually called the SEPs for short. And I'm bringing these to your attention now to highlight that NGSS science is not all about information and facts. You know, there's just too much science information for anyone to really know. So instead, we want students to learn skills. And the skills we want them to learn are the skills that scientists use, like, for example, asking questions and defining problems, planning and carrying out investigations, constructing explanations and designing solutions, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. And those are just examples. It's not the full list of the SEPs, but the idea is that students are, quote unquote, figuring things out for themselves rather than absorbing information from the teacher. And this comes from research on how students learn by the National Research Council, among others. Okay, next slide. Our report includes a couple of vignettes where we describe in some detail NGSS lessons that we observed. And as you can imagine, getting kids outside of the classroom and into the natural world is a really powerful way that teachers can incorporate environmental literacy into their science instruction. The natural world is chock full of phenomena that teachers can use to engage students, to get them to ask questions, to motivate them to want to figure things out. And that's what Next Generation Science Standards are all about. So as an example, in our report, we describe a third grade class whose instructor wanted to get the students acquainted with their local natural environment. So they went on a walk as a class to a local park. And the teacher pointed out trees on the trail that asked students to explain whether the trees were the same species as the ones they'd already seen based on characteristics of the leaves. So he was engaging kids in the science and engineering practice, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information that we just saw on the SEP list. The teacher explicitly referred to one of the NGSS cross-cutting concepts, patterns. The teacher suggested that the students use patterns as a way to distinguish and classify tree leaves, and the students talked about patterns that they saw in the leaves. So we also have on the screen here probing questions that the teacher asked as they walked through the park. How does this habitat look different? Think about climate change, and why does the city plant trees on a warming planet? Why do we take care of trees? Why is it important to take care of places like this? How do you feel about all this? He's bringing it back to the student's personal experience because that's where the learning happens. And this questioning enables him to both kind of gauge students' understanding and possibly their misconceptions, and also spark their curiosity. Okay, next slide. Here are some other lesson ideas that integrate environmental literacy. When teachers use environmental phenomena, such as pollution, to drive instruction, it's a really effective way to engage students in learning scientific concepts and skills. Kids care about pollution. It's like, let's investigate the quality of the water in our local river. And planning and carrying out investigations is one of the science and engineering practices. Discussing environmental changes such as wildfires can inspire students to think about how much of an impact their own behaviors can have on the environment. And often, by focusing on the impacts of human activities on the environment, a class can come up with solutions that can make a difference. Like when one school didn't have a recycling program and a class at the school decided to create one. So the students got this idea and they wrote to the PTA and asked for $1,000 for recycling bins. And they set up a recycling program for the whole school. What grade level do you think that class might have been? I'm pausing for effect. It was a kindergarten class. We've heard from many teachers about NGSS instruction. I didn't know my kids could do that. And we've seen that environmental literacy can really inspire students to make a difference in their community or for their community. And that inspiration can lead to the kind of experiences that leave lasting impressions and even influence career choices. So finally, this photograph relates to another point, which is that raising awareness of environmental issues can have a rippling effect. And in this instance, there was a school that was hosting a full-day NGSS professional learning event, and they encouraged their attendees to bring their own coffee mugs and utensils so they wouldn't have to use disposable ones. Okay, next slide. One teacher went as far as to say that she would always encourage students to try and solve environmental problems that they learned about. I'm never going to teach something about the environment that kids cannot do something to make a difference. In the garden, you can have them compost or even recycle. There's things you can do. There's overlap with civics. You can change the world and make a positive change. Okay, next slide. As you probably can imagine, interest in environmental ed is not new. It's California. Environmental literacy champions have been advocating for the incorporation of environmental literacy into the school day for decades, beginning in 1976 when schools were required to adopt instructional materials that explained the necessity of protecting the environment. More recently, in 2003, legislation was passed that came to be known as the California Education and the Environment Initiative. And then today, the most common schema for the field of environmental literacy in California is the environmental principles and concepts commonly referred to as the EP&Cs or the EPs and Cs. Multiple agencies, both in environment and in education, collaborated to produce the EPs and Cs, and the state board approved them in 2004, and importantly, required that they be included in textbook adoption criteria, and not just for science, but also for history, social science, mathematics, and English language arts. In 2015, 2 years after the NGSS standards were adopted in California, the California Blueprint for Environmental Literacy was published. And then in 2018, Senate Bill 720 was passed, which encouraged school boards to support learning experiences related to environmental literacy, and saying that those experiences should be available on an equitable basis to all students in California. Okay, next slide. The environmental principles and concepts. There are 5 principles, and those are shown here, and each principle contains 2 to 4 concepts. And in essence, they say that we want all students to learn about how humans are dependent on and how they benefit from the natural world, and also how we, humans, impact and influence the natural world. So an environmentally literate person is one who can analyze environmental issues and make decisions that reflect some understanding of these complexities. Okay, next slide. I wanted to show you a page out of Appendix 2 of the California Science Framework. Appendix 2 is devoted to environmental literacy, and it explicitly shows, for some, but not all, of the California Next Generation Science Standards, which standards have a connection to one or more of the EPs and Cs. So this is how the page looks in the framework, and here is where the EPs and Cs show up in this rectangle right here. In fact, if you have a print copy of the NGSS, the EPs and Cs are provided on the pages of the standards that have environmental links, but you won't see the EPs and Cs, I don't think, if you look at a digital copy of the NGSS online, because I think they uploaded what's available online before the EPs and Cs were linked to the NGSS. So your best source for that information of standard to EP and C link is Appendix 2 of the Science Framework. So that's my last slide. I hope that I've made the case for why supporting environmental literacy is important. Just to recap, first, focusing on the environment is something all kids can relate to. It provides an access point to learning scientific content and more for all students. Second, environmental literacy is a great fit to the NGSS. Environmental phenomena are excellent drivers for NGSS instruction. Third, students really need to gain an understanding of how humans depend on and how humans influence the environment so that they can consider complexities and are able to make informed decisions as citizens in today's world. And finally, the EPs and Cs are in the California Ed Code and are meant to be taught on an equitable basis to all students. Okay, now Katie's going to talk about considerations related to supporting environmental literacy.
Thank you, Burr. As Burr just said, I'm going to discuss a couple of ways that you can support environmental literacy instruction as a leader in your community. Next slide. Given that many teachers have a limited understanding of and experience with both the NGSS and environmental literacy, here are 2 actions that you can take as a community leader to support educators. You can partner with local organizations that support environmental literacy, and you can encourage environmental literacy in schools and districts. I will now discuss each of these. In our report, we talk about how 3 Early Implementers Initiative districts developed and fostered partnerships with local organizations. Please reveal. 1 district partnered with a variety of organizations, such as Cal Recycle, the Bureau of Land Management, and the local preserve, for outdoor environmental literacy instruction. Next point, please. Another district worked with a local park, and teachers at multiple grade levels have convened to plan cohesive NGSS-aligned lessons centered around this environment. In addition, this particular district's project director remarked that partners such as the California Regional Environmental Education Community Network are providing support to teachers to develop environmental literacy lessons and are even offering them a stipend. The plan is that these lessons will be shared more broadly. Third point, please. A third district is working on developing partnerships with local businesses to foster students learning about their food. Also, students learn about the impacts certain farming practices have on the environment and their community, and how to farm more sustainably. An administrator who's working on developing these partnerships wants his elementary school students to have a greater understanding of where their food comes from, the science and engineering that goes into agriculture, and the career and education opportunities they have in these areas right in their community. So these are some examples of why administrators are important. And as Burr discussed earlier, the Early Implementers Project paid attention to administrators and how they're important for NGSS implementation. At the end of this presentation, I will describe a couple of resources related to planning and enacting environmental literacy instruction. Next slide. In addition to forming partnerships, community leaders can encourage environmental literacy instruction in students' neighborhoods. For example, after a summer institute focused on environmental literacy in one district, teachers made connections with the NGSS and a local park to which they often take students for field trips. Specifically, one teacher said, the local park can provide context for earth, life, and physical science, plus some writing. The local park is a place full of phenomena with questions to explore. Teachers can also learn about the environment by participating in local community events. In another district, students and their families attend a local annual bird festival to learn about migratory birds that visit the wetlands in the wintertime. In the same district, they observe a colony of 60 to 80,000 bats that fly out at sunset during the summer months. These seasonal events may cause students to ask questions about their local habitat and make connections to their in-class science learning. So these environmental connections can be made in a schoolyard as well. An elementary school teacher from a large urban school district discussed how the environment is all around us, and teachers can take advantage of having their students notice, question, and learn in the local community, even in and around a big city school. The school received a grant from a local organization and planted fruit trees. Students can now go out to a garden area instead of just a patch of weeds. Next slide. However, this teacher believed that even with a patch of weeds, we can talk about what's growing here, what wants to grow here, what seeds are brought in by the wind. It's a huge wake up to them to realize that there is nature right outside. Look, we found the slug. Look, we found the salamander. So the idea is that, wait a minute, we're out here in the city, but look at all this stuff that's all over the place. So being in the garden can spark students' curiosity. Also, by observing plants and animals in the garden, students can better understand the life science topics that they're learning about in the classroom. This teacher said that the contents in the garden is stuff that we can be aware of and we can learn about. It's marvelous. I love environmental education for that reason, because everything is the environment. Next slide. So we're now going to go to the next part of our agenda, which involves challenges that LEAs may face when addressing environmental literacy. Next slide. From the Early Implementers Initiative, participants discussed 2 types of challenges related to incorporating environmental literacy into their science instruction. So the first challenge they discussed involves integrating environmental literacy lessons in physical science. The second challenge I talked about was sometimes needing to align the timing of science topics in the curriculum with when events are occurring in nature. Next slide, please. During teacher interviews, evaluators encountered the perception that environmental literacy is readily integrated with life or earth science, but less so with physical science. For example, one teacher said, "I don't think of environmental ed as integrated into anything other than the earth and life sciences." The perception of a disconnect between environmental literacy and physical science may be a broader outcome of some teachers' general discomfort with physical science compared to life or earth science. However, it is possible to integrate physical science and environmental literacy. During one district summer institute, teachers read about and discussed the relationship between amounts of the chemical element lead in community water systems and students' academic achievement. Acting as their students would, the teachers designed engineering solutions for removing lead and tested different local sources of water. At the end of the week's investigation, they discussed how real-world environmental problems can be used as a context for NGSS instruction. Next slide. Also, it can be difficult to reconcile school calendars and schedules with the timing of environmental phenomena, as noted by this teacher. A challenge of scheduling lessons when certain phenomena are happening in the natural world, the monarch butterfly migration, ladybug hibernation, or maple leaves turning color. Furthermore, taking students on field trips requires resources that may not be readily available to all schools. Next slide. In addition to the specific challenges described by participants, LEAs should consider the following when promoting environmental literacy instruction. One, that environmental literacy is new to many teachers. And two, some teachers consider environmental literacy as an add-on. Next slide. Teachers range in their knowledge of how to address environmental literacy in their science instruction. For example, here's a survey question from the 2017-18 school year taken by hundreds of teachers in the project. And these teachers did not have much professional development on the NGSS. About half of these teachers reported that they did not or had a poor understanding of how to address environmental literacy in a science unit. To support teachers in their environmental literacy instruction, community leaders can make their school or district a space where teachers can be comfortable expressing their need to understand more about teaching environmental literacy. And then also, in order to teach about it, teachers first need professional learning experiences to gain familiarity with environmental literacy. In addition, some teachers express concern that environmental literacy is something else to learn and teach on top of the NGSS. For example, one teacher said, "I mean, right now, it seems like the EPs and Cs are another thing that I have to think about. I'm just barely trying to get a grasp of NGSS itself. I mean, I do talk about environmental topics in the units, but I haven't cross-referenced with the new environmental stuff to make sure that I'm including everything that needs to be talked about in there." Districts should integrate environmental literacy into NGSS professional learning so that it is viewed as connected to the standards rather than as a separate topic to teach. Next slide, please. We are going to conclude this webinar by talking about just a couple of resources. Perfect. Here are 3 resources that could help you to support environmental literacy instruction in your communities. The first resource is a tool for educators to identify aspects of environmental literacy in their lessons. A second resource is from the Lawrence Hall of Science and contains resources for teaching science outdoors, including student activity guides, videos, and additional instructor support materials. So the third resource, as we've referenced throughout this webinar, is the report on which this presentation is based. It's the Early Implementers Evaluation Report on the synergy between environmental literacy and the NGSS. Next slide. Here's a list of additional references that are found in our report and that we talked about today, including information about the environmental principles and concepts, and the Environmental Literacy Task Force, who created the blueprint. Next slide. We want to thank you so much for attending our session. We really hope that you check out our report to learn more about this topic. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at btyler@wested.org and katenilson@wested.org. We hope that you have a great day, and we await the Q&A session of this webinar.
Thank you, Katie and Burr. For the next segment, our panelists are going to turn on their mics because we have a few questions for our presenters. Katie, I'll start with you. Do you have recommendations for how to secure funding for NGSS related field trips?
Well, that's a great question, Mary. Thank you. So this can be an additional benefit of developing relationships with members in your community around environmental literacy. They can help with materials and speakers, but it's possible that they can also provide funding for things like field trips. Especially in these times, it's no small matter to pay for and conduct field trips. We also want to remind you about another point we made during our presentation. So our slides included outdoor learning as a general topic, but field trips are just one way, because as we've discussed with the urban city teacher, you can utilize the schoolyard to spur environmental literacy instruction. So field trips do not necessarily have to be formal. You can have environmental literacy instruction all around and even in the schoolyard.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Burr, how do you think COVID-19 and other pandemics can be addressed through environmental literacy education?
Right. Well, the pandemic is itself a pretty compelling phenomenon that could be used to drive instruction about things like human body systems, maybe microbiology, or even the physics of disease transmission through droplets, that kind of thing. And students can also learn that being in certain environments, like outdoors, can slow the spread of the virus, and also that the virus can be transmitted globally, and why it's important to be aware of its spread. Things that come to mind.
Thank you, Burr. Another question for you. What recommendations do you have for an educator who would like to adapt these standards, but perhaps has a reluctant superintendent?
Well, we actually did see something like this in one of the early implementer districts when a change of leadership occurred. And what worked was a couple of principals went to the superintendent, or it might have been a cabinet meeting, and enthusiastically advocated for the standards. And this goes back to what I mentioned, and Katie also mentioned, about the importance of administrators, especially principals, in implementing new standards. So I'd recommend that the educator reach out to their administrators and get some buy-in from them and have them be advocates. And of course, link it to the superintendent's instructional priorities if at all possible. And there's another important point I wanted to make about this actually, and that's when you're advocating for new pedagogy or new standards, it's really essential to share real examples, videos, materials, even student work. So you're showing them, not telling them what you're asking for. Examples are really powerful, and actually hands-on activities can also be really persuasive. I attended a leadership meeting in a district where the early implementer project director, and actually his whole core leadership team, supported him in leading the whole group of administrators in the district through an activity to illustrate what NGSS instruction was. I think the phenomenon was that bubbles, small bubbles, attach themselves to a raisin when it's dropped in a cup of water. You know, that happens. And the principals in the district were actively engaged in this investigation to help them explain why that happens, which is exactly the kind of thing that students would be doing in an NGSS classroom. So it was really eye-opening for them. So in brief, I'd say show rather than tell. And again, if you can link it to what you know about the superintendent's instructional priorities, that is really helpful also.
Wonderful, thank you. Some really concrete examples within your answer. I appreciate that. So Katie, we've talked about the important role of principals and superintendents as well. How can school boards assist in this process?
Absolutely, great question. Thank you. So kind of as we discussed in our presentation, community leaders, which we are also thinking about includes school boards as well, can assist in forming community partnerships and can encourage environmental literacy instruction. Also, school board members have connections with community organizations that potentially can be utilized. And I think it is really good to rely on school boards as well as superintendents and principals for forming a lot of these connections, as teachers may have limited time and have limited access to do this themselves.
Great, thank you. Burr, do you have any ideas on how the NGSS can be implemented with distance learning? I know that's been a real challenge for teachers this spring, and as we look towards the fall, it would be kind of interesting to see how we can continue making sure instruction can be NGSS aligned, even with a distance or hybrid learning model.
Absolutely. Yes, this is the million-dollar question, isn't it, of the time? But I do have some ideas, and they're based in part on interviews that we've conducted since schools have closed. So the first thing is, in distance learning, you're not going to have the students for 6 hours a day. You're going to have them for just 2 or 3 hours a day. So you really need to get them engaged, and you need to be efficient with that time. And as Katie and I both talked about, environmental phenomena can kick off some wondering and inquiry that's very engaging for students. And then you can use that natural curiosity to drive instruction in other content areas. So we actually saw elementary early implementer teachers had a lot of success when integrating science and ELA or ELD, English language development as well. And at first, the reason that they were doing that was so that they could make time for science, because they already had very full schedules. But then they discovered benefits for their English language arts curriculum and covering standards. So if I can give a shameless plug, we even wrote a report about this called The Synergy of Science and ELA, Means and Mutual Benefits of Integration. And it's available on the resource page of the WestEd website. The report talks about how natural it is to integrate science and English language arts, particularly because of the science and engineering practices that I showed on one of my slides, and how integration benefits students, particularly English learners. Another thought is that because the environment is everywhere, students can just go outside and observe in their backyard or a local park, or as Katie said, even a patch of weeds. All of those can present opportunities for students to just notice things in their environment, and they can bring their observations to the distance learning classroom and discuss and share and ask questions of each other. And then the teacher can follow the lead of the students and what they're finding interesting, you know, keeping in mind the standards that they need to be mindful of, but they can use that information to guide their next learning activity or topic, or what reading to share or video to show. And actually, speaking of videos, even before COVID-19, teachers sometimes used videos to expose students to phenomenon, because as Katie mentioned, sometimes the timing is not right to be able to just go outside and see a phenomenon that you want your class to be exposed to. So in a distance learning situation, showing a video can get students wondering, and again, talking to each other, explaining their ideas, maybe recording their thinking in a Google Sheet notebook. This is the power of the NGSS and of science. Once kids get talking and wondering about a phenomenon, the teacher can introduce an article for students to read. And at that point, they want to read it. And it might bring in history, social science, or they might add some data that relates to the phenomenon for students to consider as a way to integrate math. And they can incorporate new information into their discussion. They can write about how their understanding has changed. Even if students, are not able to engage in hands-on engineering or investigation, they can still engage in discourse, and that's really powerful learning. And they can engage in some other SEPs too.
Thanks. Katie, I kind of want to follow up on that for a moment. One of the things that we've been talking about is the return to school, and a lot of districts are considering some form of a hybrid model where students are on campus for shorter periods of time, as well as some distance learning at home. But thinking about that time back on campus, we envision that students will have to be socially distanced. Do you have any ideas on how NGSS can be implemented with social distancing at schools?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, this is definitely something that's at the forefront of everyone's minds and everyone's discussing right now is what will instruction, not just science instruction, look like in this new time. So to kind of like piggyback on some of the things that Burr was saying, we feel like that students can still do a lot of the NGSS science and engineering practices, even if they're in a hybrid situation or at home, learning from home. Students can use different online platforms. They can use classroom management programs. They can use Google Docs, Google Sheets, different ways online to collect data. So they can collect data individually, whether they're in a classroom but they're dispersed and not adjacent to their peers, or whether they're at home. They can do a lot of data collection individually, but then they can use these online platforms as a way to share data. And then they can engage in discourse, as Burr was saying, with each other, and they can not only share their data, but discuss ideas with their peers and kind of have that discussion part that can be done online. So in the online programs can also be used to engage in other SCPs related to science and engineering practices, related to analyzing the data and interpreting the data that they're individually collecting. And then they can also use these programs and even like different presentation formats to communicate their findings. So yeah, we're definitely thinking that they can still use these different they can still use these different online platforms as a way to engage and to discuss and wonder about phenomena they're learning about, but it will probably look a little different than how it was looking before COVID-19.
That's an excellent point. I'm going to ask this question of both of you. How important is collaborating with local nonprofits or organizations to implement the programs highlighted in your presentation? What if our community does not have a large environmental community engagement?
Yes, that's a great question. You know, it's not necessary to partner with anyone to teach environmental literacy, but it can be enriching and it can open doors and present students with engaging phenomena or interesting information. And it can, importantly, help connect students with their immediate environment or community outside the classroom. But just like the environment is everywhere, there are organizations, industries, and businesses that can be fodder for environmental instruction. Take waste, for instance. Wherever people live, there's at least one agency that's dealing with waste collection, and it's likely that there's another agency that's working with composting or recycling. And these kind of enterprises are rich with opportunities to learn about the interdependence of humans and the natural world. And so if you can't take a field trip to the waste treatment plant, and I have gone to a couple and they're really interesting, but if you can't take your students to a plant to see how they like receive and treat and sort, or maybe just landfill the waste, then you can at least have someone come in and talk to the students and maybe bring some data, or maybe where you live is protected, where wildlife is protected, or maybe you have hunting or fishing. You know, really any business that's impacted by environmentally based regulations could be food for discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Burr. And yeah, just to add on to that a little bit. So as we discussed in the presentation, students can learn about like growing food and different human impacts related to the environment through partnering with agricultural companies. So I think what's key here is like you don't necessarily have to specifically partner with environmental organizations to enact environmental literacy instruction. You can kind of take advantage of the science happening and the different organizations that are businesses or companies that are doing work that definitely have scientific impacts to learn about. So just wanted to kind of highlight that one example again.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. So it looks like we don't have any more questions. And with that, I just want to thank both of you for your presentations today. And I want to thank our audience. To access this presentation, you will be able to find the recording and slides posted on CSBA's Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, also known as STEM, instruction page under the Governance and Policy Resources section of the CSBA website. And again, I just want to thank our presenters, Burr and Katie. With that, thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.